I've showed you how we can create an empty object using object literal syntax like this, and then set up inheritance by assigning the private prototype property of the object to whatever other object we want to assign it to. So in this case, we're having our new empty object here inherit from this object up here. And so when we call the sayHello method on our object, we should get back this hello string. So this object here is called the prototype object. In this video, I'm going to show you a different way that we can accomplish these two steps by using a method on object called create. Over at the Mozilla Developer Network, we can take a look at the documentation for object create. And in the summary, you can see that what this function does is it creates a new object and sets up inheritance. In other words, it makes the new object inherit from a specified prototype. And that object gets passed in as a first parameter to this function. You can see this takes an optional second parameter of properties, and we'll look at that in a different video. Let's jump back into our code and look at a couple of examples. Okay, what I'd like to do is to create a new object. I'll call it my object. And the way we'll do that is by using this create method. And as a first parameter, we'll pass in another object that we want our new object to inherit from. In this case, I want it to inherit from my prototype object, which is defined above. In the debug console on the right, I'll type my object and we can expand it to take a look at its properties and its prototype chain. Notice that the prototype pointer is pointing up to this prototype object here. And that's why we have a sayHello method. And when you look at this object, you can see that its prototype pointer points up to a different object. And we'll talk about this prototype when we get to constructor functions or native constructor functions. So with this, we can call the hello method, sayHello method on our object, and we should get back our hello string. So this line here is equivalent to saying my object is equal to a new empty object, and then manually assigning this prototype property to the prototype object above. And then the JavaScript runtime takes care of the rest by allowing prototype lookup for our properties. So when we type myObject.sayHello, the JavaScript runtime will look in this object first, and if it doesn't find it there, it will jump up to this object, and then it will find that property here. So instead of doing it this way, we can just use this method here, which has the benefit of being compact, but also doesn't require that we assign to a private property, which is the __ proto property. Next, I'd like to talk to you about something called native prototypes. And these are objects that come with the JavaScript runtime. You could say that they're objects that come out of the box. And this is an example of a native prototype over here. This is the object native prototype. So typically, native prototypes are off of a property called prototype, on various native constructor functions, like this object constructor function here. And so over in the debugger, if I take a look at this object function by using the console.dir method, we can drill in and see it has a property on it called prototype. I'll have to scroll down a bit to find it. And inside of that prototype property are a bunch of functions. And so this right here is just an object, just like the one that we created up here. But it's been created for us, and it comes out of the box with JavaScript. So it turns out that by default, all of our objects inherit from this object here, which is defined off of object object.prototype. So if I want to, let me show you this more explicitly. Inside of the object.create as the first parameter here, instead of having this inherit from my custom object up here, what I'd like to do instead is to have this inherit from the prototype object of object. Now, prototype right here is just a property name, but it points to an object that has those methods that we just saw. So now over in the console, let me type my object and we'll take a look at it again. This time around it looks empty, so what I'm going to have to do is use console.dir and use that method so that we can drill into this object. When I expand it, this time around, notice that the prototype property points up to object prototype, and we get all of these properties for free. And so if I were to call, for example, my object has own property, we can call that function because it exists up here in the object prototype. Now there's many other native prototypes. For example, we have date, number, array, and a bunch of other ones that you're probably used to seeing, even Boolean. And if you want a total list, you can go to MDN and take a look there. That's a great reference for this kind of stuff. Just to show you one more example, let's create an object that inherits from the date prototype. And then over in the debugger, if I look at my object and inspect it, you can see this time around, its prototype property is pointing to the date prototype. And so we get all of these functions for free because we're inheriting from the date prototype. So I could say my object.toUtc string, and I'll probably get back an error because we don't actually have a date value stored. But hopefully this shows you how our object is indeed inheriting from the date prototype object. And we can take a look at that date prototype object explicitly by just typing date prototype. And sometimes you'll have to put it in this console.directory method. Now, one of the things I could try to do here is just not pass in a parameter at all. So we'll just call object.create and see what happens. You'll see that we get an error, and it says that the parameter has to be an object or null. And so JavaScript is telling us that it wants us to be really explicit here about what we want. But one of the cool things that you can do with this create function is to pass in null. And this tells JavaScript that we don't want our object to inherit from anything. So in the console, if I type console.dir and we take a look at the object, this time around its prototype property is not set. In fact, it doesn't even have any properties. So if I try to call a function that we normally have on our objects, like toString, I'll just get an error that says that undefined is not a function. And what this error is telling me is that the property toString is undefined. And so we can't call it because it's not a function. In this video, we looked at how you can use the create function to create a new object and assign its prototype property to some parent prototype. Then we also looked at a couple of native prototype objects like object prototype and date prototype. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this function is it's not available on some older browsers. So let me show you over on MDN what you can do to see which browsers support this function. If we go back to the MDN documentation and scroll all the way down, you can see that typically you'll see a section called browser compatibility. And for this object create function, you can see it's supported in Internet Explorer 9 and above, and Chrome 5 and above, and so on.